This November, Californians will be asked to vote on a number of propositions, including whether to raise taxes for schools, eliminate the death penalty, reform 3 strikes, and a myriad of other issues. When it's all said and done, however, Prop 31 may end up having the biggest and longest-term impact on state government of any of the propositions. Its backers say it would be a big step toward improving the way California is governed, but opponents say it is poorly defined and will only lead to lawsuits and confusion. What are the specific provisions in Prop 31? Which provisions are the most controversial? And will it make the state government better or worse? We'll hear from 2 supporters of Prop 31, Pete Weber, state co-chair of the Yes on Prop 31 campaign and a board member of California Forward, and former Assemblymember Juan Arambula. We'll also hear from those who oppose Prop 31, Anthony Wright, Executive Director of Health Access California, and Lenny Goldberg, Executive Director of the California Tax Reform Association. Prop 31, government reform or Proposition Overreach?
From Fresno, the Maddy Report, with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Kepler.
Welcome. Among the issues the voters will be asked to decide in November is whether to approve Prop 31, which restricts the legislature's ability to pass certain laws, expands the governor's authority to reduce spending, and changes public budget and oversight procedures. The question is, will it make the situation better or worse? Former Assemblymember Juan Arambula and Pete Weber, state co-chair of the Yes on Prop 31 campaign and a board member of California Forward, back Prop 31 as a sensible reform package. Welcome back to the Maddy Report. So, Pete, where did this initiative process come from?
Well, it came from California Forward. It was developed as a model measure. California Forward is a nonpartisan organization funded by the 5 largest foundations in the state of California. And they created California Forward because they knew that California's governance is broken and it wasn't going to get fixed from the inside. They needed an outside nonpartisan body to develop reforms and try to get them passed, and so that's where the initiative came from.
Okay, well, Juan, Prop 31 does a lot of things, so let's get right to it. One of the changes is this 1-year to 2-year budget cycle. Why is that necessary?
Well, I think it's important to look back over the last couple of years. Pretty much since this century started, we have not had an on-time budget. We have had revisions mid-year, largely because of rosy projections about borrowing money, about gimmicks to try to balance the budget, without really dealing with the underlying problem. So by looking at a longer term, we would smooth out some of these fake assumptions. We also would like to see 5-year projections so that we can bring our revenues and our expenses into alignment. And the 1 year just isn't cutting it.
You know, it kind of hits tangentially on another topic, and that is the issue of transparency. One of the parts of this provision talks about 3 days that a bill would have to be available before you vote on it. Is that another problem you see, what you saw as a legislator?
Yes, literally I had bills that I was asked to vote on that were still warm to the touch. They had not even cooled off by the time they came from the printing press over to our desks to vote. So having 3 days to look at a budget before a vote can be taken is another aspect of Prop 31 that I think would help the budgeting process in California.
You know, Pete, there's another thing in here called a pay-go provision, and that is that the legislature has to justify expenditures with offsetting revenues or spending cuts. It does apply to tax cuts, correct?
Yes.
Okay. What about the argument, though, that pay-go does nothing to curb the real spending in California, using bonds to finance long-term expenditures?
Yeah, let me give you some perspective. First, pay-go is intended to curb the legislature's insatiable appetite for spending. You know, every single year since before the turn of the century, we have spent more than the revenues that we have taken in. We can't continue to do that. And so what pay-go does is it says any expenditure for any program, new program expansion, or tax cut that costs more than $25 million has to have an identified source of funding. And we think this is absolutely essential. It worked very well at the federal level when it was in place during the 90s, and then it lapsed. And look at what's happened since then. We now have $16 trillion in debt at the federal level. So it's absolutely essential that we have some means of curbing the legislature's inclination for spending.
Is there any concern, Juan, that this might result in more ballot box budgeting? That people go, since the legislature has to show the spending cuts or the revenue to pay for something, people say, well, we can't prove that, so we'll just do an initiative. We'll go around it.
Well, the voters always have that option with our referendum and initiative process. But I believe Prop 31 would help eliminate ballot box budgeting because the legislature would be doing the public's business, and there would be less need for the public to try to get around the legislature because of their inability to get things done.
You know, this proposition also calls for performance-based budgeting. What about the argument that this is just an invitation for more fudging and fantasy budgeting?
Well, if you believe that you should spend your funds wisely and in the areas that are giving the biggest results, then you will support Prop 31. That's essentially what it means. We want to measure what it is that we're getting for our tax dollars, and we want to invest our money in those areas that are going to give us the best return.
We have about 30 seconds left in this segment. What if a new program is paid for the next year, but turns out not to be paid for 5 years forward? Then what?
As Juan says, you have to bring these elements of the proposition together. So you've got the PAYGO provision, but you also have the 2-year budgets in the context of a 5-year look at revenues and expenses. So you have to show how you're going to pay for something for at least 5 years.
Okay. Well, thanks. So when we come back, we'll talk to Juan and Pete a little bit later. But up next, those who oppose Prop 31, why they think you should vote no. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome. Not everyone thinks Prop 31 will improve state government. Two of those who oppose Prop 31 are with us today. Anthony Wright is the Executive Director of Health Access California, and Lenny Goldberg is the Executive Director of the California Tax Reform Association. Welcome to the Maddy Report.
Thank you.
Well, Lenny, we've talked to proponents about some of the specific provisions of Prop 31. Do you have any objection to the 2-year state budget cycle?
Well, I've actually like a 2-year state budget. But the reality is it's not going to make any difference. The reality is we're on 6 or 8 month budgets. We've had emergency budgets in February, another one in September, just before that. We're in a deep hole, and when it gets deeper and revenues turn down, we have another, coming to grace with our budget problem. So, it's a nice concept, but it will have little or probably no effect on our real budget issues.
Well, what about the transparency issue? I want to ask about that too. Say we're going to give in this proposition.
The victim of gotten amends at the end, but even just the implementation of that. Often a bill has to be amended at the very end where people come up with problems. You want good law. You don't want law forced into a mold where you can't even correct or amend a bill with the problems it has in it.
I think one of the issues with Prop 31 is that it's a mixed mash of ideas that are not necessarily coherent together, and there are some good ideas mixed in with some really bad ideas. But one of the big problems is that regardless of whether it's a good or bad idea, this is stuff that really shouldn't be in the Constitution. This locks us in for a generation. You have to go back to the ballot, to the vote of the people, to make any changes to virtually all of Prop 31. It takes Prop 31 is over 8,000 words. It's longer than the U.S. Constitution, and we're shoehorning it into the California Constitution without really being able to change it. And so, a 2-year budget, some limits on gun amends, things like that. These are all things that the legislature can and should do as part of its normal rules. It shouldn't be in the Constitution locking us in for future generations.
I wonder how many people are going to read the 8,000 words. They're probably going to just read the summary. But let's go to the PAYGO provision.
Well, that's part of the problem, right?
We're going to watch this show.
Well, there you go. Well, we hope so. So the PAYGO provision, that says that the legislature has to justify any expenditures of more than $25 million with offsetting revenues or spending cuts. Proponents say, the state's structural deficit is a direct result of constantly creating ongoing problems without an ongoing way to pay for them. How do you respond?
Again, the concept of PAYGO is a good one. I mean, we support it, but the way that this is drafted, it's so poorly drafted that it has these huge unintended consequences. So for it really doesn't achieve the goal. It has these large exemptions for existing programs, for bond debt, for initiatives. The entire initiative process is totally exempt from this pay-go provision. So it creates this incentive for people who want to start a new program to just bypass the legislature and go to the ballot, rather than deal with the issue of, one of the big reasons about our structural deficit is that we've had folks go to the ballot with putting demands on the general fund without having any way to pay for them.
Stem cell research, high-speed rail, et cetera.
Right, and so they've totally exempted the initiative process. And so what does that do? That means anything that passes in the legislature is legally suspect, will be under the cloud of litigation under this provision, whereas anything on initiative would not be. This actually makes things worse in terms of dealing with these types of issues.
Let me add two things to this. One is $25 million is lower than a rounding error on the state budget. So if they wanted to talk about, this is kind of every little program, those programs are not the cause of our structural deficit, not at all. The cause of our structure, and it says, well, you want a new program, identify a source of revenue. I can identify literally billions of dollars of loopholes that would not affect any ordinary citizens and would not affect the business climate in California, but I can't get a 2/3 vote. So then you're left, the only thing you can do is cut. Now, with regard to even that, it allows us to reinstate without pay-go all the spending cuts since 2008. I have to say that some of those spending cuts were probably legitimate. Those are programs that didn't need to be there anymore. Those can all be restored. But if you want to say something that is a similar program, some way you have to pour old wine in new wine in old bottles, but it just ties everything up. So the only thing you can say about this, it's way too low. You can't get the revenue. You're going to have to do cuts, and then it's full of all these exemptions that we'll pass every bond issue.
Well, let me get to a few more questions, though.
Okay.
We've only got about a minute left in this segment.
Okay.
Do you want to add one quick point?
I just think that it not only will not achieve the goal of fiscal prudence that its proponents want, but it will be overly restrictive for us to take advantage of opportunities. So if the federal government creates a new opportunity for us to get significant federal matching funds, that could tie our hands to basically just take advantage of those opportunities. So if Healthy Families, the program to cover low-income children, if that was created under these rules, we would have a hard time taking advantage of that 2-to-1 federal match to do it. It's those kinds of things that means that this is too restrictive on one end and has huge exemptions on another end.
Let's go another question. Proponents are saying they're concerned. Opponents say that they think that the governor should have the ability to declare a fiscal emergency if the legislature doesn't act. What is your concern with that? Isn't that just making the legislature more responsible?
This is giving the governor unilateral power to make cuts. This is something that voters rejected in 2005 with Prop 75. They should reject it again. This is the antithesis of transparency. It allows the governor to make cuts without hearings, without any of the oversight that we have through the legislative process.
Well, thanks. So when we come back, we'll discuss more about Prop 31 and focus on some of the more controversial issues. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. We're looking in detail at Prop 31 on the November ballot with two of its proponents, former Assemblymember Juan Arambula and California Ford board member Pete Weber. Well, Pete, one of the more controversial aspects of Prop 31 is that it would permit the governor to unilaterally cut the budget during fiscal emergencies that he or she would declare. Is that placing too much power in the hands of one person?
Let me tell you what happens today. If the governor declares a fiscal emergency, the legislature has 45 days to act. Now, if they don't act, you just go on to day 46 and 47 and 60 and 68 and so on and so forth. Nothing happens. So what this provision does is it says if the legislature fails to act in a declared fiscal emergency within 45 days, then the governor has the ability to act unilaterally and make spending cuts as he deems appropriate. What this is intended to do is incent the legislature not to abdicate their responsibilities to act in a fiscal emergency within a specified period of time.
Okay. Juan, another concern of the critics of Prop 31, one called the Molotov cocktail, is it allows local governments to adopt these things called community strategic action plans to replace state regulations if, one, the plan is the functional equivalent of those regulations, and 2, the state agency or legislature does not veto the local changes within 60 days. So the question is 60 days too short a time? What if the legislature is out of session?
Well, if the legislature is not in session, the 60-day clock does not start to tick. This is not an attempt to sneak anything through in the dark of night, but it is giving the legislature, when they are in session, 60 full days to respond to local concerns. You know, Mark, one of the interesting things that I've noticed is that we want government to be close to the people. We want it to be local. That's what this proposition tries to do. Sacramento does not have all the answers. One size does not fit all. And if there's a locality or a region that wants to do things different and still comply with state laws, but do it in a better way, this would give them that opportunity.
Well, what about the argument that there's going to be all these lawsuits, people arguing over whether or not the local change is the functional equivalent of the state standard?
Well, this has been thoroughly reviewed by many, many lawyers and law firms, and our view is that it is legal, but obviously any lawyer could file a lawsuit if they chose, and most propositions do have challenges to them. I'm very comfortable that this is a constitutional provision and that it will bring government closer to the people.
Any concern that way, Pete?
No, I actually, there's a very rigorous process for developing a so-called community strategic action plan. It is a very public process, so the likelihood that there's going to be any rogue, approaches going through that process are virtually nil. Furthermore, the legislature then has the opportunity to veto it, and so I don't see it. I think it's a.
Does the veto have to be a 2/3, a simple majority? What does the veto have to be?
Simple majority.
Okay.
Yeah.
There's another argument that's out there that they're saying that this will result in a patchwork of regulations in California, hurting companies that seek predictability and undermining consumer and environmental protections. How would you respond to that?
Well, there's not one red herring in there. There's 2 red herrings. First of all, it's interesting that the opponents of this measure are the defenders of the status quo. If you think the status quo is working well, then you probably don't want to vote for this measure. So this does not in any way affect general statutes that have to do with environmental protections or consumer protections or labor laws and so on. What it applies to is only the delivery of state-financed public services, and there's lots of precedent for the state to give flexibility to local governments. However, so far it's only been done in pilot programs that almost never get to scale. What this does is open it up so that you can have communities making decisions, as Juan suggested, that are, here's a better way for us to do this thing. And it requires that the counties and the cities and the school districts agree on that approach. And so, Sacramento is not the font of all wisdom. Local government often has better answers, and we believe that this is a step in the right direction of bringing government closer to the people.
Well, let me ask you one last question. What would you say to those that say that no matter how well-intentioned this proposition is, it further undermines our representative democracy by taking more power away from the legislative branch?
I think that's a weak argument by the opponents. This proposition brings government closer to the people. It forces the legislature to do the public's business out in the open, and if they don't respond to the public as opposed to special interests, which is what they do now, if they don't respond, then representative government will find somebody else to take their place.
30 seconds, Pete. Last word.
Yeah, I agree. This does completely the opposite. It actually brings government closer to the people, making government more transparent, devolving some responsibility from state government to local government, stop the micromanagement from Sacramento, let communities figure out the best way to achieve the objectives that all of us want to find, reduce unemployment, improve health, improve public safety, and so on.
Well, thank you very much. It's former Assemblymember Juan Arambula and Pete Weber from California Forward. Up next, those who oppose Prop 31. What do they think of some of the more controversial proposals in the measure? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. As noted earlier, Prop 31 also allows local governments to adopt what's called community strategic action plans to replace state regulations if 1, the plan is the functional equivalent of those regulations, and 2, the legislature or state agency does not veto the local changes within 60 days. So, what do you think about this? Do you think this is going to foster innovation? Is it better than a one-size-fits-all?
I mean, we think that this is a way that we can undermine health, human services, labor, environmental protections that Californians appreciate and need, allowing different localities to have different rules, different standards. It really puts a hindrance on our ability to meet state or national goals, whether it is on health care and getting people covered or in foster care or other key programs. It also is reflective of how this Prop 31 is not completely well written, in that the proponents say that they were not intending to include labor and environmental standards, but the reason that labor groups are opposed, the reason that environmental groups are opposed, is because their reading is that this would include that. So, it's an example of how this could really have a lot of unintended consequences.
Well, what about this idea that local governments are going to draft functional equivalents that'll be as good or better than state regulations because they're worried about lawsuits? They're going to try to do a better job. Do you agree with that?
My guess is that some counties will try to avoid state regulations and use this new power and the money that goes with it to try to avoid some of these key things. You've got a very diverse, red county, blue county situation, and we don't know, there are a lot of people who don't like some of the laws and standards that apply throughout the state. So if they have a chance to overturn some of these standards that the legislature and previous governors, and we've had mostly Republican governors until now, a few years of Gray Davis, but Duke Major and Wilson, Schwarzenegger, they passed these as matters of statewide interest. Now we're saying, oh, well, County A, County B can try to slough that off. The legislature can disapprove after 60 days, but if they try to do this, they file in September and the legislature's out of session. Well, there's no, that's just a mistake, and it's an example of why you don't want to put 8,000 words into the Constitution full of drafting errors.
I wanted to ask you that because, they've got 2 months to respond, and so the question is, what's the problem? Can't the legislature respond within 2 months, or the agency can? So you're saying the legislature may not because they're out of session. What about the agency responding within 2 months?
Again, I think that the proponents have yet to. I have not heard them provide what is the issue that could be resolved with this that they can't do now, but we can see lots of opportunities for a local county or locality to do mischief and to subvert the goals of a state or national effort to meet, regardless of whether it's on a human services program or whether it's with the environment.
And let me give you an example here. I've worked on human services in the past, and Anthony works on health. Counties have a lot of, the legislature is constantly saying, here's some flexibility. Let's see if we can integrate those services. Let's say not have the little separate silos, but in human service and health delivery, there's a ton of work that has been done by the legislature that gives the counties ability to implement good programs. We haven't heard one example of where these regulations are stopping that. Secondly, the one thing that this does that runs 100% or 180 degrees counter to what they are trying to do is this costs $200 million a year going out for our planning process. And it's not a pay-as-you-go. They completely violate PAYGO. It just comes straight out of the general fund. And, to set up a planning process, it's not even going to mean anything.
I've only about 30 seconds left in this segment. I want to ask 2 quick questions. One deals with legislative oversight. Part of this provision says that the legislature should spend some more time thinking about the laws they've already passed and seeing whether they work as opposed to passing new laws. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, the politicians, not to mention even term limits, but just the politicians running for some other office, turning over, they're not around here. Ken Maddy was around here for many years, and he provided substantial oversight. If he passed the bill, he'd want to know how it was working 5 or 10 years later. That doesn't exist.
Okay, 10 or 15 seconds. Last question. That is the idea of focusing on performance. What's the problem with that?
Again, there's some good things in this initiative. It's a well-intentioned measure, but it's flawed. It's badly written. It has lots of issues that make the problem worse. It shouldn't be in our Constitution, and it makes a budget process that's bad worse by making it less transparent and less straightforward for people to understand.
Well, I want to thank our guests for being here. Anthony Wright, the Executive Director of Health Access California, Lenny Goldberg, Executive Director of the California Tax Reform Association, Pete Weber from California Forward, and former Assemblymember Juan Arambula, all for joining us. If you want to stay current with Valley politics and policy, you can sign up for our award-winning newsletter, The Maddy Daily, by logging on to our website at maddyinstitute.org. And now, another perspective.
Good evening. I'm Bill McEwen, Fresno Bee columnist and a longtime observer of California politics. On November 6, California voters have an opportunity to continue their reform of state government. Already we have improved the legislature and the political conversation by giving the important responsibility of redistricting of the state assembly and Senate and Congress to a citizens panel. We also have modified term limits and made them better. And this year we began using a top 2 open primary system to elect state lawmakers and congressional representatives. Next up is Proposition 31. It would require the state budget to be public for at least 3 days before it's put to vote. In addition, California would join other forward-thinking states and switch to a 2-year budget cycle. This is a much more effective way to plan and decide spending. Proposition 31 would require identifying funding sources for new expenditures of more than $25 million, a provision commonly known as PAYGO. Finally, state programs would be regularly evaluated for effectiveness. Critics of Proposition 31 say it is unwieldy, too ambitious. This is nonsense. Proposition 31 is the next logical step to reform California government and bring transparency to the state capital's infamous gut and amend midnight deal making. This is Bill McEwen for the Maddy Report.
The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect those of the Maddy Institute, the California Channel, Casey, or Valley PBS. If you'd like to share your thoughts about the points and opinions shared in the Maddy Report, visit our website at valleypbs.org/Maddy. This has been the Maddy Report. Thanks for joining us.